On this episode of China Unscripted, is Australia about to have a China reset? China's trying to dominate global biotech, and how the West can beat China at its own game. Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Ganeshta.
And joining us today is former Australia-China Council scholar Andrew Phelan. Andrew, it's great to have you on the podcast.
It's great to be with you guys. I've been a fan, as you know, for a long time, and I feel like I'm hanging with some old friends here.
Hanging, how Australian colloquial. Very nice.
Don't you say that?
No, hanging is something... We don't say that in America, right? I'm gaslighting him.
Okay. Just like old friends.
Just like old friends.
Right, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's been a lot of really big China news lately, but, we're not going to talk about any of that because the real story is Amber Heard and Johnny Depp's
Matt,
trial.
No, Chris, no.
I mean, this, right, guys? This is what we want to talk about.
Well, the China news is always getting crowded out by, Meghan Markle or Johnny Depp or whatever it is. The news du jour.
Yeah. Well, which is why our politicians don't actually do very much on China because they're too busy following like the Johnny Depp trial.
Well, hey,
Right.
Speaking of politicians, there were elections in Australia recently, and there's been some big changes. Why don't you tell us what happened? Like, how is this going to affect Australia's China policy?
Okay, so just for an audience outside of Australia, Team Blue is the Liberals, who are the equivalent of the Republicans in the US, and Team Red are the Labor Party, the equivalent of the Democrats. So the colours are swapped over.
Just remember, it's Australia, it's upside down.
So now, just to confuse everyone,
Right?
right from the get-go. So the Labor Party, who have not been in power federally for 9 years, won the election and secured a majority, 76 seats. The election was a disaster for the government, which is a coalition of two parties, the Liberal Party and the National Party, the LNP coalition. And some seats were picked up by a group of so-called independents whose nickname has become the Teals because of their teal colour, who have been financed by Simon Holmes à Court, who's the son of Australia's first billionaire. He's a resources billionaire, the late Rupert Holmes à Court. And so the question was, were they genuine independents or did they have some kind of group, some, maybe informal or affiliation? And they've been very controversial because the government lost some what were considered safe blue ribbon Liberal seats. So that's been a watershed in terms of this particular election.
And so one of the differences with Australian politics and the U.S. is that in Australia, like any parliamentary system, the new prime minister is the head of the majority party. So they immediately switched prime ministers, who's now the head of the Labor Party.
No, well, he was already the leader of the Labor Party. So we don't have primaries like you do in the US, where, the candidates fight it out and then you get, whoever emerges the winner leads his party into the election. Doesn't work like that here. So, for example, the Liberal National Coalition, who just lost the election, have already chosen their leader, the leader of the opposition, who, unless there's a coup, he will lead the LNP into the next election.
So it's not Scott Morrison anymore.
Right, but that's what I mean.
No.
Because you guys don't have a president who's elected separately. Your equivalent of a president is the prime minister, but
Yeah.
He or she is just whoever is the person who's the head of the majority party.
Correct. Yeah. And yes, you're right, Shelley. Scott Morrison, did the captain's thing and resigned as leader of the opposition immediately as the results were coming in, and they come in very quickly. So he won his local seat, so he'll stay in Parliament as a backbencher, for the time being. I think he accepted responsibility for the defeat. And I think we lost some really good people that lost their seats. My local member here, Tim Wilson, and just full disclosure, I probably voted Labor most of my life, but I'm a member of the Liberal Party, I should point out, and have been quite involved in meeting some government ministers and senators and so forth over the last few years, including on the topic of China. But I've also been involved in reaching out to the other side of the aisle as well. And I've met, when I came back to Australia in 2015-16, Michael Danby, who was a federal member for a large seat here in Melbourne, who's been very active in terms of, the Uyghur cause, the Tibetan cause. In fact, I sat next to Michael a couple of weeks ago when I was invited by the Victorian Council of Uyghurs to their end of Ramadan celebrations. So it was an issue on both sides of the aisle. The concern about China has been a bipartisan issue largely, but there have been some differences. And there was a lot of questions being asked during the election campaign about how the Labor Party, if they won, would handle the relationship with China.
Mm-hmm.
And what do you think about how they're handling the relationship with China?
Yeah. So just before the election, there was a series of articles written about Richard Marles, who is now the Deputy Prime Minister and also the Defence Secretary, or the Minister in charge of Defence. And he bobbed up in a bunch of articles because he'd been meeting with the Chinese embassy unofficially, kind of, as they say in China, to go by the back door, as it were, in a kind of Kissingerian sort of style. With a view to keeping the lines of communication open and so forth. But, he did a trip to China a couple of years ago that was funded by a somewhat controversial think tank in Canberra called China Matters. And China Matters, what my friend Rowan Kallick, who did 2 tours of China with The Australian as a journalist, he's a great writer and knows China well. He's what Rowan refers to as the Engaginistas. In that they always make the case you must continue to engage with China. Anyway, Marles came back from that trip a couple of years ago, went on TV the next morning and seemed to regurgitate CCP talking points, as if they'd planted a subcutaneous chip inside of him. I couldn't believe it. I was floored by what he was saying. There was the usual stuff like, the CCP deserves credit for lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, that type of thing. But it went further than that. He made a speech while on his trip, and he forwarded that speech to the Chinese embassy in Canberra to see if it was okay before he gave it. So he copped a lot of criticism for that. And one of the things I did, I had a cup of coffee with Senator James Patterson, emerging really, really smart guy. In terms, because he and Andrew Hastie, who was the Deputy Defence Minister in the outgoing administration, he was also an SAS soldier in Afghanistan. Those 2 politicians and another guy from the Labor Party were supposed to go to China, sponsored and funded by China Matters. They were supposed to go next. So I had a cup of coffee with James, and he wanted to know kind of do's and don'ts and what my thoughts were. And
so, don't go to China was the don't?
Well, he and Hastie were of the position, we're not going to go if everything's orchestrated, preordained, scripted. And one of the things I said to him was, if you've got veto power over the itinerary and all that sort of stuff and the freedom to say what you want and all that, go, But I said the way Marles has gone about it is not what I would, it's the opposite of what I would do. Just kind of falling into line and taking the tour as it was orchestrated by others. And it turned out that Senator Patterson and Andrew Hastie were both, the following week, were both denied visas. So they ended up not going at all. So
yeah. Well, you got to be like Michelle Bachelet, the UN human rights person who had her fully orchestrated tour of Xinjiang and discovered that, China did lift 100 million people out of poverty.
Right. Whatever.
Or hundreds. Yeah. I mean, we couldn't half see that coming, could we?
Yeah. I mean, so the person, I just want to be clear, the person that you said took this orchestrated tour of China and came back regurgitating like that propaganda, he's the current defense minister?
He was sworn in a few days ago as the new defense minister. Now, I've never met him. Michael invited me to his retirement dinner, and I would have sat right next to him, but I ended up not going because my mum was ill. But I haven't met him. So the line I take on that stuff is to give people the benefit of the doubt, because we have politicians that have done sponsored China trips, maybe as recently as 5 years ago, that have kind of woken up to what's going on, and they're saying For example, the leader of the opposition in the state of New South Wales, Chris Minns, who's from the Labor Party, said, I've learned from that experience, and I would, behave differently today. I probably wouldn't have taken the tour. So I think people deserve credit for that. We can't expect the broader community to have the same perspective and the same experience on China as us China nerds have, So I think we need to allow people a little bit of leeway and a bit of forgiveness to a point.
Well, I think definitely the whole trade war essentially woke up a lot of people in Australia to the threat of the Chinese Communist Party. But I'm wondering, with this new administration is this going to be a situation where they're going to seek a reset? They're going to try and go back.
There seems to have been a lot of, I saw an article in the China Daily yesterday, the propaganda paper, about how, it's time for Australia-China relations to have a reset. And
time for Australia to cave to us.
Well, even within Australian media, right, there's been a lot of, before the election, a lot of speculation about will Labor do a reset of the China policy. Do you think that all this reset talk is having any kind of effect?
I think it's a classic case of China influence at play here. So we have a new ambassador, and the outgoing one left with a pretty sour relationship. The new guy is by his reputation, very sophisticated, urbane, speaks about 5 languages, and he's been civil, almost friendly. So he hasn't been behaving like a wolf warrior. And so the mainstream media has interpreted that as he's offering an olive branch. And I don't see it that way at all. And the reason I come to that conclusion is the comments in his speech. He used the phrase, changes not seen in 100 years, which is sometimes changes not seen in hundreds of years. And that's one of Xi Jinping's favorite phrases. If you read Rush Doshi's book, The Long Game, he refers to that quite a lot. And what that phrase means essentially is, hey, you know what? It's the end of your time in the sun, Western world. Our time has come, So I don't see underneath a more friendly exterior, I don't see anything that's changed. And as somebody who's sat around the negotiating table in what I like to call the trenches of commerce in China, and done business there for a long time, and know how the Chinese negotiate, he's not giving anything up at all. So if I was advising the new administration, I'd be saying, don't fall for it. Stay the course. And so far, I would give, as I said on Sky News the other day, I would give Penny Wong, the new foreign minister, and Anthony Albanese, the new prime minister, I would give them pretty high marks for maintaining the line. It's almost been a seamless transition in terms of the stance that they're taking on China. Now, early days, they're only 1 week into government. We'll see. They're going to be tested. And what's happening, you mentioned that letter, Shelley, that came from a bunch of, concerned scholars. And most of the people that signed that letter, I know, and they're definitely part of the Engageanista camp. You must do business with China. You must deal with China, blah, blah, blah. They don't mention China's grand strategy, what it's doing, how it's manifested in the region. And I think the Solomon Islands, and somebody sent me the draft agreement that the day it came out. And I stayed up that night looking at a bunch of things. A year ago, I went on Sky with Chris Smith and talked about the Solomons. I realized how important geographically and strategically the Solomons is, as are other states in the Pacific, but particularly the Solomons. And you guys did a show, you did a bit of stuff from the Philippines, right? And you were in Manila. Did you ever go to the US War Cemetery in Bonifacio Global City when you were there?
No, we didn't.
No.
Okay, well, if you get back there, I highly recommend you go, because it's the largest US war cemetery in the world, outside of the ones in the US, of course. There's about 5,000 or 6,000 crucifixes in that cemetery on a sea of grass, and the odd Star of David. And in the middle of the cemetery, there's these murals depicting all the battles of the Pacific War. Leyte, Milne Bay, Kokoda, the Solomon Islands, Guadalcanal, Coral Sea. And what you realize when you look at those murals is that the logistical nexus between the US Navy and Australia was critical to the war efforts in terms of supplying troops with food and fuel and stuff out of Queensland, and also transporting from Hawaii and Guam, closer to that part of the Pacific, which is obviously vast. You realize how critical that was. And China's play around the Solomons is to be in a position where, if it wanted to, it could have PLAN vessels rock up in that part of the world and potentially interdict the cooperation between the Australian Navy and our, mutual defence treaty ally, the US. So it's incredibly significant. I think it's got a lot of people. It's certainly got mainstream media attention and mainstream attention like China and these issues have never had before.
Well, how do you think the new government is weighing relations with the U.S. versus relationships with China? I mean, the first thing the new prime minister did was go to a Quad meeting.
Yeah. Well, even before that, he was asked in a press conference about the reset and what he would do. And he said, the first country I'll be reaching out to is the United States. So that was a huge relief for me to hear that. He so far hasn't budged. I don't think he's been sucked in by the whole reset conversation. But even today, one of the universities here in Melbourne, La Trobe University, and Dr. Ewan Graham, who's at CSIS in Singapore, is a friend of mine. He used to run that, and there was quite a few healthy debates. There was one, for example, between Clive Hamilton, who you guys know, and Professor Hugh White, who's a military strategist. And I thought that was very healthy. But since Ewan's left, I've seen La Trobe seems to be having these panels where everybody already has the same view. And it's, we must re-engage. Out on Twitter today, they're inviting people to an event all about should we reset? And of course, if you look at the way that event is portrayed, it's, Australia's rhetoric, we could have managed it better, and so on and so forth. So Australia's the bad guy. We need to use diplomacy.
Hold on. So the last 2 years has been a time when, after the Australian government just called for an investigation into the origin of the coronavirus without actually accusing China, the Chinese Communist Party launched a trade war that hit Australia extremely hard.
Remember the 14 points that Australia had to do better? Yeah.
Right.
And then they call them the white trash of Pacific.
Among other things. So Crybaby Nation, chewing gum on the shoe.
Yeah.
Our rhetoric is the problem.
Yeah.
But I don't understand this. So it's okay, for 2 years, the Chinese Communist Party has had this trade war that they launched against Australia. Are we seeing this reset? Is this amnesia? Or is this
yeah, what is going on? What worldview is this?
Yes.
What's happening?
Exactly. Well, things started to go south when Malcolm Turnbull was Prime Minister, because he made the decision to bar, and he was pretty tech savvy for a Prime Minister. He was an early investor in an internet company. He did very well out of that. And, after studying this, they decided to ban Huawei from Australia's 5G network. And of course, Australia was the first country to do that, set the precedent, kind of showed the way. And since then, the US has barred Huawei, then the UK, who was already quite advanced in their discussions with Huawei, and then finally, a couple of weeks ago, Canada. So Australia's done incredibly well out of China's rise. They've had a huge appetite for our commodities, and they've kind of unwritten our wealth for the last couple of decades. And I think certainly Xi Jinping would have been thinking, you've done really well out of us. You're one of the few countries that has a trade surplus with us. You kind of owe us one, and you should fall into line a little bit, because, the relationship economically has been so good for you, but we're a treaty ally with the US. And I think, as Mearsheimer might say, you choose your security over your prosperity every time. And so I think the banning of Huawei was a huge, decision in terms of the impact it had on the relationship. And why is that? Because I think Huawei, and I had friends that worked in one of my mates, one of my American friends worked for Cisco in IP. he used to travel up to China all the time from Singapore. They've been pilfering stuff from Cisco, Motorola, T-Mobile, Nortel, like crazy for a long period of time. But it was access to the 5G network that was the real issue. And when we said no, I think that had a huge impact, because Huawei is essentially what I like to call the digital cornerstone of Belt and Road. It's the eyes and ears in the communication network of Belt and Road. So when Australia said no, I think Xi Jinping was not happy, And I think he's, and since we pushed back and stuck up for our sovereignty, I think he's pretty annoyed.
I mean, you hurt his feelings. He's a sensitive guy. I mean, remember, he gets upset when people compare him to a lovable cartoon character.
Right, absolutely. And then on the pandemic, and the perspective I bring here is, when I was based in Singapore, I spent more than a decade in medical technology, medical devices. I've been in operating rooms all over Asia, including in China. I worked in the infection control space for a while for a Swedish company. And during that time, we'd just come out of SARS and MERS. I was speaking to a lot of hospital infection control specialists, WHO people in Hong Kong and so forth. And they're, world-class people. And so it's been particularly interesting for me watching how the pandemic started unfolding right from the get-go because of that experience. And, what the Prime Minister did was to say, wouldn't it be great to get to the bottom of this, and so it doesn't happen again? And if you compare the way that China responded to SARS versus COVID, it was actually more transparent, during SARS. There was a period of time where there was more media freedom and more scrutiny was allowed than under the Xi leadership.
Well, the WHO was not in China's pocket at the time.
Yeah, I mean,
really
actually, the
hard.
WHO kind of forced them to open up a hospital in Beijing where they had been hiding some SARS patients. Like, they were trying to pretend there was no outbreak in Beijing, and then the WHO demanded to inspect this hospital. And so, there were a lot of media reports, like in the Wall Street Journal, about how the WHO's actions really probably saved a lot of lives by arresting the pandemic much sooner. And now, totally,
Oopsie.
Whoops.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's
Yeah,
not an oopsie. It's the CCP then spent, the next decade trying to take over the WHO.
Yeah, right. They actually lobbied hard for Tedros's predecessor, Margaret Chan. She spoke at a Gates Foundation meeting I was at in Jakarta. But then they really went out on a limb with Tedros. It's the art of buying off the corner office. You don't need the whole organization. You just need the corner office, which you can get at a discount. And then you let the Americans pay the big chunk of change for the WHO. The guy calling the shots is, doing your bidding for you. It's brilliant. They're really good at it.
Well, so this kind of goes back to what we were asking earlier, like how, clearly the authoritarian regime is the bad guys. Why are there Australians who think Australia is the bad guy?
That's a great question. One of my favorite kind of China experts in over here is John Lee, and he was born in Malaysia, Malaysian Chinese, and he was Julie Bishop a couple of foreign ministers ago. He was her personal China advisor, and he gets super frustrated by the constant criticism of our own country, and he wasn't even born here. He's more patriotic than most of these people. I think there's some connection between those that have leftish views and giving China a free pass for some reason. And I can't quite fathom what it is. But I guess some of the other things at play here are the mainstream media is not terribly well equipped to cover China. That's one factor. It's now very hard to get people into China, of course, correspondents to get their visas approved. And so there's a lot of folks that don't necessarily have China experience that are commentating on China. And I think one of the other factors is what I like to call elder statesman syndrome, which is, it's a big meaty world issue, right? And if you're a, significant person, you're going to weigh in and have an opinion on it, even though you might not have any China experience, or you might have been there once or twice and stayed in a 5-star hotel in Beijing, Shanghai, or Guangzhou, which is a bit like going on a first date, as opposed to getting married.
Yeah, I mean, first dates aren't really a good barometer, like as Johnny Depp figured out with Amber
Oh my
Heard.
God.
So
I knew you were going to go there, Chris.
well,
I feared you were going to go there, Chris.
yeah, it's what the people want, apparently.
Yeah.
Yeah, we should just call this podcast that
The
and see
Amber
if
Heard
we can
podcast.
boost the views a little. Yeah.
That's a good idea. Yeah,
Yeah,
thumbnail.
our listeners will not feel tricked at all.
No, yeah, they won't be angry.
Well, just on that point, Chris, I love the way you've called China Uncensored edutainment, because talking about China, particularly, I think it's one of the issues from a academic point of view. It can be pretty dry and boring a lot of the time. One of the reasons I've got involved in, and I had never had any ambition whatsoever or interest to become a journalist or a media person, but I felt kind of compelled since I came back to Australia, and my graduate studies and scholarship were paid for by the taxpayer, right? I felt compelled to kind of share my experience and what I knew and kind of give back as well,
Yeah, I mean that's great. To me, I never understood why people would think China news is like dry. Like it's always been so insane to me.
Right.
The scripts write themselves most of the time.
You did start China Uncensored during like this huge power struggle within the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, there's massive power struggles. They were building artificial islands. It's like
it's all crazy.
It's all crazy.
Yeah. I love it too. It's it's a passion, and I've been following general hostility with great interest for many years.
Yeah, I would say it is more juicy than anything with Amber Heard and Johnny Depp.
Right. Well, I used to live walking distance from the big red walls of Zhongnanhai,
Oh, yeah.
And wouldn't you love to be a fly on the wall in there sometimes? The palace intrigue must be pretty saucy, to say the least.
Yeah. I mean, the best thing we did was start to compare it to soap operas.
That was fun.
Yeah. That was definitely good.
I mean, I like all the praise for our show, Andrew. So, I mean, if you have more things you want to say that are nice, like
the suggestion box, I'd like to see Matt Gaznida do a few more impersonations. I love the Trump one. Don't do the Australian accent.
Well, I think we've already.
It's pretty bad. Yeah, no,
okay, so
I accept that.
I feel like Matt has 3 impersonations, and we've just ruled out one of them.
Wait, I have Trump. I have Australian, which is next. What's the other one?
You've done Russian a few times.
I have done Russian.
You dubbed Putin a few times.
Yeah, well, I do have some Russian heritage.
Yeah, but that doesn't help your accent.
No, it really doesn't. That was many generations ago.
Hey,
right.
The Quad or anything else to talk about.
I mean, I kind of want to talk about China's medical technology stuff.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, Andrew, like you said, you spent a lot of years doing business in China, especially in that sector, and there's a lot of, it's pretty evident that over the last decade or so, like one of the long-term things that China wants to do is to become a leader in biotech and medical, in the medical field in general. And, we already see a lot of, for right now, it's things like, masks or, alcohol wipes, like kind of not expensive things being made in China, but we are becoming more dependent on them. How do you see this going? Are they going to be successful in becoming this biotech giant?
They want to become the umbrella corporation or company. Resident Evil, Shelley?
I've never played it. Sorry.
So, Shelley, that's a great question, and it's a huge topic because healthcare is super complex, right? It encompasses everything from aged care to infectious diseases and all sorts of things. And it's a controversial subject in every country. But it's interesting. Noel Ferguson from Stanford Hoover Institute, who I'm a huge admirer of, he did a series called "History is the West History," about the rise of China and the challenge of China to the Western world. And he put it that the Western world has been able to maintain a gap on the rest for the last 500 years, basically since the Portuguese arrived in Macau, because of what he called were 5 or 6 killer apps. One of those killer apps is Western medicine, and how that's evolved over a long, long period of time. and how it's cultural. If you look at the rise of East Asia, the tiger economies beforehand, and they figured out how to industrialize and make an automobile a good car in the space of probably about 25 years. But medicine and healthcare is it's a very complex ecosystem. So, for example, in China, where you don't have an independent judiciary, because of that, you don't have a medico-legal system, right? You can't take a private hospital or even a state-owned hospital to court. You're going to have a hard time taking a drug company to court and that sort of thing. My last trip to China, late 2017, it was on behalf of a Texas company called Gcon Bio, and they make pods. They're essentially biopharmaceutical factories that are made off-site, and then they look like kind of big shipping containers, but they have the HEPA filters and all the air control and all that stuff. They can also be used for patient isolation. And Pfizer was an early investor in GCON. So Pfizer was able to make its COVID-19 vaccine in half the time because they ordered these pods and they wheeled them into a shell building. They didn't have to build a new factory. But that meeting was about CRISPR, which is a cutting-edge gene editing technology that's used against cancer. But whether it's CRISPR or clinical trials around vaccines, and China has a horrendous legacy issue around vaccines, they jump steps in the clinical go-to-market.
Well, there was the case where a couple of years ago where a scientist created 2 CRISPR human twins. It was supposed to be immune to AIDS or something.
In China, but then he got essentially disavowed by the Chinese government, right?
Because it was a scandal.
He Jiankui. Yeah, he was arrested because of the scandal, actually, because that scandal created a great loss of face. But it's, I've been to a lot of surgical conferences over the years. The guys from mainland China are generally on last, and most people don't hang around too often. There's cancer patients in China that are paying good money to have online consultations with oncologists in the US because of the trust factor. Now, on the equipment side, Shelley, when I first went to China in '88, people didn't have fridges and all these sorts of things. I remember visiting a hire factory in Qingdao back in the day. And of course, they're the #1 white goods manufacturer in the world now. But I've also been to the China Medical Equipment Fair, which is this, in Shenzhen, which is this huge scale thing. And China makes, there's a company called Mindray or Mindray out of Shenzhen. And they make, they're in a lot of hospitals around the world. They make good equipment. At that trade show, I saw Chinese companies making advanced technology products like MRI, that companies that weren't around 5 years before that. And there's a company based out of Shanghai that recently bid for a contract with the University of Sydney Medical Centre, and they're making PET-CT. So that's a pretty advanced technology. The problem is not with the ability to make good equipment. The problem is in the software, i.e. the people skills and the discipline around good clinical studies before you take a product to market. And I'd also add that if you're a foreign company and you're trying to commercialize medical technology in China, like for other sectors in the economy, it's difficult, but it's particularly difficult. I mean, I'm involved with another Texan company in the medical imaging space, and it's taken them 7 years to get FDA, and it's cost a lot of money. But, the process is challenging because the FDA wants to make sure that before this technology is deployed in vivo, i.e. out in the real world, it works. It's safe and efficacious. And those guardrails, as I mentioned, are kind of avoided in China. Is this race to catch up or surpass the West, as it were. This is it's been, if you're trying to get a product through the SFDA, which is the Chinese version of the FDA, they use that as a way to get their hands on your IP, on your blueprint. So it's a very, very tough market, and there's corruption all over the Chinese medical system. It's generally a, pay up front, you jump the queue type of proposition, and doctors there are paid poorly, so they're not incentivized to do anything else in terms of their annual remuneration. I hosted a couple of German surgeons on a trip to about 3 or 4 cities in China at one stage, and they were doing lectures and being involved in a couple of live surgeries and so on. I remember being in Changsha, I think it was, and I was in the operating room, and people were going in and out of the operating room. People were using their mobiles in sort of the operating room. I'd never seen anything like it in a Western country. But the 2 German surgeons, good teaching hospital, university in Germany, but they were from the former East Germany, and we took them to Lushan, which was kind of a summer retreat for Chairman Mao. And they were just like, get us the hell out of here. This is the last place we want to be. But I remember being down in Guangzhou, and we were having dinner with one surgeon, and he suggested to the 2 German professors, he said, we'll use this company's device. This patient had bilateral hernias. And he said, look, we'll use this company's device on one of them, and we'll use this other company's device on the other. And one of the German surgeons shook his head. He said, no. He said, we don't experiment on real patients, So there was, China's got a long way to go before it's going to be able to compete and compare with medicine compared to, US, UK, and other countries. It's got a long way to go.
Now we know that, because of recent research, that China is essentially using its doctors, its surgeons as executioners, harvesting organs of still living people. So this is going to be a real problem when the doctors themselves are essentially just tools of the state.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why they're trying to keep the organ harvesting stuff so, they're faking organ donation data. There's been research that's shown that the organ donation data follows the quadratic formula. It's impossible things.
They're kind of even lazy about how they fake the data.
I think that's one of the reasons that the idea that these hospitals, the military hospitals or whatever, are doing these essentially killing prisoners of conscience for their organs. They have to keep a lid on that, because that's going to blow up their whole, reputation with what they want to do in terms of the medical industry and become a leader.
Mm-hmm. And well, I guess the point, Andrew, you're making is that really what makes a country kind of become a superpower isn't just its industrial capabilities, but also its medicine.
100%. And it's generally one of the last areas of these newly industrialized economies to take off. So, for example, in South Korea, 20 years ago, the healthcare industry was pretty undeveloped. But as the country got richer, and when people do get richer, they're willing to spend more money, and they do spend more money on advanced healthcare. So that whole ecosystem sort of goes up. Although in South Korea, there's far too much cosmetic surgery done. I remember being up at, I think, Seoul National University Hospital, and one of the neurosurgeons was telling me, we can't get young guys to do registrarships in neurosurgery because they want to go up, down at Apgujeong and do nose jobs and boob jobs because it's so lucrative. Everyone wants to have that K-pop look. And a lot of people from China were going over to South Korea and having that surgery done as well. And in fact, I was in Chengdu meeting with a bunch of local aesthetic plastic surgeons one time. Not a trip I wanted to make. I used to look after a range of products that was called SAM, S-A-M, which stood for subcutaneous augmentation material. And it was designed for facial-maxillary surgeons in the event of gunshot wounds, dog attacks, car accidents, where the face was injured and surgeons need to do reconstructive surgery. But these guys were using it off-label and not for its intended purpose. They were using it for aesthetic surgery. And they were quite unscrupulous, actually. So I recommended to my company at the time to shut that business down. And even though it was quite lucrative financially, they went ahead with that, and we exited that market in Asia to stop the off-label use, which was, again, quite unethical, But I think also, back to general hostility for a second, I think one of the reasons that Xi Jinping is sweating at the moment is because he's put himself into a corner in terms of COVID-19 management, and it's come at a great cost to his position and his power. And it's funny, it's the old medical economies, as it were, the UK, the US, that came up with efficacious vaccines in unprecedented time because of their real strength in this space. And China's not been able to have as efficacious vaccines. They've not released phase 3 clinical trial data and so on. And so what were the tools in their arsenal? Well, they had to go to lockdowns. And so, but that's obviously not sustainable. Even Tedros has been saying that. He's tried to put a bit of space between himself and the Chinese regime for obvious reasons. But, I remember at the start of the pandemic, Italy was the only G7 country to sign on to Belt and Road. And she was saying to the Italians at the time, hey, we should include healthcare in Belt and Road, I think she fancies China as a healthcare player. And it's no disrespect to Chinese people. They're fantastic Chinese doctors all around the world. And they've been able to move very quickly in good medical technology, as I mentioned. But for all of those constraints, in terms of the Chinese system, they come home to roost in the healthcare space in very powerful ways. And that's why China's not ready to compete like for like against, the countries that have been doing it well for a long time.
It's been interesting watching the lockdowns that have been happening lately, because it's not just the lockdown, but it's also kind of like permanent quarantine hospitals being built, right? Permanent testing stations being built, and like constant mass testing of people. And the question people have had about this is like, why are they doing so much testing? Like, why aren't they putting, effort into vaccinating people, even with the Sinopharm vaccines or whatever that are not as good. But I think one of the things is, and this is my hunch, I don't have a lot of data to back this up yet, but I think this goes back to what you were saying, Andrew, about like people skills. A lot of the people who are doing the quarantine management in China are migrant workers or kind of like temporary workers. They're not necessarily healthcare professionals, right? Like you can get, they're all wearing those like big white dabai suits. So like they all kind of look the same, but sure, you can train somebody to, like put up fences. You can train someone to do a nose swab, but like they probably don't have the infrastructure to be able to quickly vaccinate a lot of people because they don't have enough healthcare workers to do it. Like you don't have to be a healthcare worker to do the mass testing, but probably to like be sticking needles in people, even Chinese people would be like, if you're not a nurse, I don't want that, right?
Yeah, they don't want some migrant worker jabbing them.
Yeah.
Well, the problem is that the pandemic has been so politicized in China more than anywhere else. And then the narrative had been written that, hey, we've got this under control early on. We're the role model here. Look at the way we've managed the pandemic. Learn from us. And of course, that whole scenario has done a 180-degree turn because, in the West, we're coming out of the pandemic and we've got on top of it largely through efficacious vaccines and other good measures. But it's funny, I used to joke with a friend of mine, an Italian surgeon in Singapore, about infections. And in fact, those plastic surgeons in Chengdu asked me, what's the best way of reducing post-operative infections? And you go into an operating room and you just see these guys are not practicing good aseptic technique. They cut corners. And I joked with my surgeon friend, it's because they can't see the bugs. The microorganisms are not visible to the human eye. So there's a tendency to cut corners. Some countries better than others in handling post-operative infections and nosocomial infections, which are hospital-acquired infections, than others. And it revolves around good discipline, essentially, and good aseptic technique. But if you look at what's been going on with COVID management, it's just frightening. They're doing the opposite of what would be good aseptic technique. And it's crazy. When you think about it, there are some excellent world-class infection control specialists in Hong Kong. And of course, they've been completely muzzled because it's been a top-down, you must get this COVID outbreak under control, which of course with Omicron, which was more transmissible than its predecessor variants, that's an impossible thing to do. So yeah, it's been a mismanagement on a biblical scale. by Xi Jinping and his and it all goes back to him. He's the guy that, he's the chief executive. He's the guy that makes these decisions and tops down and give these orders. So I think he'd be under enormous pressure at the moment.
Well, it may be a biblical scale, but good thing for China is that they've already had practice rewriting the Bible.
Yeah.
100%.
Well, so speaking of this, because this does kind of tie back to Australia, the idea that, the problem with everything happening in China now is Xi Jinping. That's something that was really pushed forward by the longer telegram, which many people suspect was Kevin Rudd, right?
Yeah.
And what was his position? He used to be
former
the
Prime
Prime
Minister
Minister of Australia.
Prime Minister.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if it's true, and so you have this kind of thread going about that, the problem isn't the CCP, it's Xi Jinping. How much is that really playing out in Australia with, the likes of Kevin Rudd pushing that?
Yeah, Kev the Rev, I call him. He's a character. I remember going to a lecture he gave when he was shadow opposition. He was the opposition foreign affairs spokesperson, and I was really impressed with him. I thought he came across quite differently as he did in the media at the time. And he's a very bright guy, and he's a good boffin in terms of China analysis. But do you guys know what he's up to these days?
He's head of the Asia Society.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
He actually introduced the Antony Blinken China policy speech.
Right. Yeah. So he's been in that role for a couple of years now, and he's paid about $1 million US a year.
Wow.
And the Asia Society, the Asia Society is an interesting one because, some of the money for the Asia Society comes from people like Ronnie Chan, the Hong Kong property tycoon who I've met, had dinner with him in Nanjing. Now, he's an interesting guy. He's a US citizen, but he also has huge business in China. And it's also Tong Chihua is also a major sponsor or backer of the Asia Society.
Big United Front guy.
Well, he was the first chief executive of Hong Kong after the handover. So I think Ronnie Chan loves America, but I think he's also very proud of China's rise. I mean, Kevin Rudd, I've seen him interview Wang Yi, and he was respectful to the point of being deferential, treating him with kid gloves, as it were, really being the diplomat. And when you contrast Rudd's behaviour in Australia, he has been relentless in his attack on the previous administration, absolutely relentless to the borderline. You kind of worry about his mental health. And when he was Prime Minister, he was quite a controversial guy. He had a few complete meltdown, like dummy spit meltdowns, when he was on the Australian version of Air Force One over a sandwich that was provided or something like that. And he famously came out of the Paris climate negotiations, and there's a famous quote that I can't repeat on air, but he essentially said that the Chinese delegation had a bunch of so-and-sos that had done something to us. I'll leave you to fill in the blanks, but you get the idea. So he had a reputation for alienating people. He hates News Corporation. He's always raving on about News Corporation, even though when he was trying to get elected, he was only too willing to work with News Corporation. Kevin, he's a bit of an odd cat, let's put it that way. But he's also been, going to China with the Hank Paulsons of this world, those kind of guys that want to stay engaged. But he won't be I don't think he'll be getting any invitations anytime soon after his comments on Xi Jinping. But Chris, I think you're right. I mean, Xi Jinping is one guy along the CCP journey, and I don't think that trajectory is going to change regardless of who's in power. It may be tweaked somewhat in terms of the intensity of what they're doing. They may adjust the settings, as it were, but I think the mission will stay the same because of the system. Xi is particularly Leninist in his approach. But I would suspect that the system would continue. There's plenty more where he came from.
What is interesting about things like the longer telegram is that it pretty transparently argues that we should get rid of Xi Jinping so that like maybe we can get a more normal CCP
Go back to
diet.
the good
Like John
days.
Zeman, he was a totally normal person.
Yeah, no.
I think.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it all goes back to what Rush Doshi calls the three traumas: Tiananmen, the first Gulf War, and the collapse of the Soviet Union. So, in the heady days of Tiananmen, and as I mentioned, my first trip to Beijing was '88. I was back there in '90, so 1 year after Tiananmen, and I was in the mornings. I'd study at the Beijing Gaoji Guanli Chuan, the high-level cadre institute,
cadre, yeah.
which is pretty interesting because I don't know what those guys studied, but they seem to just hang around doing nothing most of the time. And at night time, the students that were there, you'd hear these beer bottles that were being broken, and that was symbolic around Xiaoping, little bottles. And the idea was, you were smashing Deng Xiaoping. It was a sort of campus protest against the crackdown in Tiananmen. And back then the beer bottles were very brittle. I know because I did an internship at Foster's Brewing, which was an adventure. Check this out. This is the schizophrenic beer can. You see that? It's Shanghai beer, and it's Foster's on the other side of the can. So, and we have a little.
Wait, so Foster's is actually Chinese for beer?
I had a feeling you would go back to that ad campaign, which is, the Australian for beer. That's a funny one because for many, many years, nobody in Australia drinks Foster's,
Yeah, everyone drinks VB or Tui's or
other stuff. Other stuff, yeah. Yeah, I actually did a branding project for a craft brewery in Sokcho, Korea a couple of years ago. We ended up calling it Moon Bear. I won an award at the Melbourne Design Awards. That's this whole separate conversation, a little job I did for some private equity buddies of mine. We ended up losing control of the business anyway, but that's life. But yeah, this memorial can has even got a little inscription on it, 今年澳大利亚总理基廷 Paul Keating went there and kind of cut the ribbon or whatever when they started.
Wow.
But the beer bottles used to come along the factory, and they used to just break after they'd been through, cleaning and heating and all that stuff. They make good beer bottles there now, but that was back in those days. But in the afternoon, I'd go into the BHP office. I was, the world's largest mining company. And back then, China was about 2% of its global sales. Japan was about 50% for iron ore. And I'd go out to the Ministry of Metallurgy and Mining, and I went out to Shogang, the capital steelworks. So, Chris, you mentioned that the ski ramp in the Winter Olympics.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when I first saw it, I couldn't understand what part of Beijing that was, but those two big chimney things, they were part of Shogang.
Oh, so open, right?
They were part of Shogang. So when I went out there, Shogang, I kid you not, had 100,000 employees. It was like a city. Yeah, it was like a city. So those SOEs have obviously been rationalized down or merged or whatever over the years. But, a year after Tiananmen compared to the year before, 88 was kind of the summer of hope, People were excited to see foreigners. In much of China, people had never seen a foreigner before. They just look at you and go, hey, Lao Wai. And, so, Lao Wai 86?
Yeah.
Yeah. Friend of the show.
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of Lao Wai 66, so I'm kind of giving away my age there. But, it's just amazing to look back on those heady days and how much it's transferred. In fact, I've known a ton of journalists over the years. Some of them have been my good friends. And on that first trip, I stayed with a family friend who was a China correspondent, Robert Thompson, and he's since gone on to become the CEO of News Corp. He was down here in Oz quite recently and caught up for dinner. But it was very heady days. A year after Tiananmen, you could still see some tank tracks around. And the BHP company, Peugeot, ended up with about 6 bullet holes in it. And they got it repaired, but they kept one of the bullet holes there just as kind of souvenir, But I remember being advised, do not be in a taxi with a local, particularly after dark. And when I went back to Beijing after Hopkins Nanjing, my studies there, I used to go past Tiananmen every day to and from work, but the atmosphere in 90 versus 88 couldn't have been any more different. There was a sort of awakening of China, this excitement about opening up to the world again, because it had only been a few years into opening and reform, right?
Yeah.
And particularly in Shanghai, I always associated Shanghai with being more welcoming to the outside world, and Beijing being the commercial center as opposed to the political center. You look at the waterfront on the Bund and you sort of associate that with prosperity and openness to the outside world and all that sort of stuff. And when I was a little kid growing up, my next door neighbor, a Eurasian kid, his dad was one of those very wealthy family that fled Shanghai, around 49 or thereabouts, and moved down to Hong Kong. They had a monopoly on paper in Shanghai, and they were so wealthy that my friend, he has photos of his grandparents with William Holden and Cary Grant. They had a whole building on the peak. So I kind of, had some clue about China and been around Chinese people since I was about 5 or 6 years of age, sort of connecting all these dots. Have you guys managed to read Desmond Shum's book?
Yeah, we had him on.
Yeah,
we had him on.
We had him on the show, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really enjoyed his book. He's 2 years younger than me, but it brought back so many memories, We both were swimmers. We both swam at South China Athletic in Hong Kong. He redeveloped the Huadu Hotel site in Beijing. That was his big project. That's where I spent my first night overseas in 1988. He worked with the late Bob Thelene of China Vest, who was this mercurial American entrepreneur that was getting all these Western consumer products into China. I knew Bob, so reading that book, it just brought back all these memories. But also, the big takeaways is how business gets done in China in the absence of an independent judiciary, in the absence of a legal system that gives people confidence in business and investors confidence, and not having that there. And of course, the CCP has always pushed back against having an independent judiciary, has made China, such a difficult place for foreigners to do business for such a long time.
So nothing new to do with Xi Jinping, despite what some people say.
No. And I think, going back to 88, 89, Zhao Ziyang, as you know, he went down to Tiananmen Square and he was very emotional. He was pleading with the students to go back to their dorms, because at that stage, there'd already been that bizarre scene with Wu'erkaixi in his pajamas, lecturing Li Peng. I remember thinking this is not going to end well. And Zhao was begging these students to go back home because he could see what was coming. And of course, since that happened, he'd been under virtual house arrest until his death. But I think when Tiananmen happened, really crushed the hope of China moving in a certain way to become more open, more Western, more liberal. And, the hawks have dominated since then. So it's just that Xi is a more dominant leader. And that's largely because China has moved through some phases where it was no longer necessary to hang on to hide and bide, hide your strengths and bide your time. I think probably 2008 is probably the year that you'd call the marquee year. China hosted the Olympics. It's kind of its coming out party. And they started to realize that, they had significant economic heft and power, particularly in manufacturing. I think this is one of the things that gives China a lot of confidence. It's a manufacturing powerhouse of a size and a scale that the world has never seen. I remember one of the reasons I got involved with studying Chinese in the beginning was, when I was a little kid, all the plastic toys and stuff were made in Hong Kong. And in the 80s, they were made in the tiger economies. And China was just starting to open up. So I thought, all that manufacturing is just going to, the cheaper stuff is all going to go into China, which of course it did. But, there's a great documentary on YouTube called The War of the Factories. And it's about World War II and how Germany, which was banned under the Treaty of Versailles from having an air force, went built one anyway, and how they built up their war inventory across, tanks, planes and guns and all that sort of stuff. And when World War II broke out, the US, they didn't really have any tanks. They weren't prepared for war. But what happened was the industrial leaders in the US, and there's a similarity here with what happened in the pandemic. My old employer, GE Healthcare, started making respirators with Ford, and so they were very nimble in being able to do that. But at the beginning of World War II, the federal government in the US at the time didn't have a great relationship with industry, but it basically gave Detroit carte blanche to go and make the weapons of war. And due to the engineering talent in the US, it wasn't long before the US war inventories overtook those of Germany. And they were making better equipment and much more of it at a scale that was unprecedented. And I just wonder if the scenario that we all fear so much, that there's an outbreak of conflict, a hot kinetic war between the US and China, how the ability to mass manufacture would impact that conflict. Would people in the US be willing to work 7 days a week and give up all those other things that generation did so well? And is China's manufacturing scale and competitiveness, would that be a huge factor in a conflict that makes it very difficult for the West to challenge?
I think a lot of this actually depends on people's beliefs in the United States. Like, the pandemic should have been the opportunity for the US to just really rethink manufacturing and start onshoring stuff. And what we saw over the last 2 years is like some companies moved out of China, but most of them ended up going to other Asian countries or Southeast Asia to do manufacturing. Like, there wasn't that much of pulling out of China and doing manufacturing in the US. And I think there was still the attitude hadn't really changed. I think, and this is my hypothesis, that during World War II, there was this attitude that like, okay, we're America, like this is our job to do this, to defend our, to provide weapons for our allies, eventually for ourselves. And it was just this very like we can do it. But we didn't have that attitude over the last 2 years in America. It was kind of like, oh, this pandemic sucks. Like,
you don't think we have the kind of patriotism?
Well, it's not patriotism. It's like we were distracted by issues like, oh, like we hate Trump, or like, the vaccine, whatever, or just like, people were confused about where COVID came from because there was so much propaganda, and just like all this confusion, right? And there wasn't like, and also like we happen to have the most controversial president in a long time in office, so that did not help things, right? Wasn't like Trump was not a uniting leader, right?
No,
and so
no.
So if during the beginning of COVID you had a rare type of U.S. president who's like really people on all sides are like, you know what, like this is my man, or this is my president, but we didn't have that. We didn't have a sense of unity. We didn't have a sense of like, what can America do to overcome? And so things were scattered. We were paying attention to dumb things, and just like there wasn't that energy for it.
I mean, I think also on a practical level, like we saw what happened with manufacturing, N95 masks or surgical masks in the US, right? Where, a lot of these there was one company left in the entire country that made surgical masks in the US.
Yeah, but even like a year into the pandemic, like California bought like what, $3 billion worth of masks from China or something.
It wasn't
like,
just California.
It's so
like
dumb.
the Biden's administration's spent lots of money buying masks from China because
they were cheap.
They were cheap.
The home COVID tests we're buying, like a third of those are from China.
I mean,
it's so dumb.
Even 3M and Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing, American company, even its China operation was forbidden from exporting PPE back to the US. So they were essentially held hostage by the Chinese government, which is, if you invest in your manufacturer in China, you're operating in that environment. It's important to understand that. A friend of mine ran the infant nutrition business for Mead Johnson, another US company in China, and took it from about 100 million to well over $1 billion in sales. But they got fined. They had to pay a $30 million fine because they were pricing the product too high. They did pretty well out of the fact that some of their local competitors were putting melamine in baby formula. So it was a trusted US operation. And so they probably were able to get away with charging a higher price. Now in the West, that would be considered, normal practice, to increase your profitability, as opposed to what that guy did with the AIDS drug, that Martin, whatever his name was, the most hated man in America. That was completely unethical. But, this is what happens. You get held hostage. And I think Rosemary Gibson has done a fantastic job in her book, China RX. She talks about how the pharmaceutical industry has become so reliant on precursors from China that it's put them in a situation where you do have a major national healthcare issue and you can't get supply. And that becomes a national security issue. So, the Chinese doctrine is unrestricted warfare. It's warfare using all sorts of means, lawfare, information, propaganda, health, and standards, the way it's been influencing the UN to shift standards and so on. These are all considered fair game, tools in the arsenal. We in the West tend to think of warfare as kinetic bang, bang, guns and bombs and all that sort of stuff. I'm not saying China doesn't do that. They're going through the largest military modernization ever. But they're using all these other methods as well. They could stop the export of fentanyl and meth precursors if they really wanted to. I mean, they can shut down somebody who's tweeting about politics in a heartbeat. But yet these precursors magically leave the country and show up in the US. And they've shown a willingness to collaborate with Mexican drug cartels to get these poisons into the US, knowing full well the damage and destruction they're causing.
I had to laugh because in Antony Blinken's speech on China policy, fentanyl was one of the things that he said that we should work with China on to, curb the production of fentanyl precursors in China.
Completely not understanding that they are purposefully it's drug warfare.
That was one of the things, climate change. They always talk about climate change being somewhere we have to work together. But
China has so much experience with climate change, with all of its, coal factories.
Yeah, but the fentanyl thing was especially
they fundamentally don't get China, but
I think Blinken doesn't get it, and that element of that speech is indicative of that. The climate change thing. I mean, John Kerry flew to Tianjin. Remember that, for a Zoom call with Wang Yi.
Yeah.
In Tianjin, and not long after that, he met the Taliban in person in Tianjin.
Yeah, Wang Yi met the Taliban.
What does that tell you about China's genuineness about working on climate change?
I think as long as they can sell us wind turbines and solar panels that they've ripped our technology off to build, then I think it's okay. We can work with them.
Yeah, right.
Engagement.
That's not, I was doing some research on CPEC the other day, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and that is, kind of the poster child of Belt and Road. It's by far the biggest engagement in infrastructure in any country. And I noted that there were 8 coal-fired power stations under that program being built. Nobody's even talking about the coal-fired power stations that China's involved with outside of China. So look, the takeaway here is, and I've got in trouble for saying that here because, look, I have a bit of a different perspective from a lot of academics and stuff. When you've been in the trenches of commerce there, and you've been through, seen all this stuff, it shapes your lens, right? Because you've got firsthand experience. And I've got in trouble here for saying that I don't think China is genuine about climate change, and I hold that view. I think they see this as an opportunity to leapfrog the US in terms of economic heft. And that's why, when I talk about deadlines like 2060, well, I won't be alive to see that happen, but, it's so far out there. It doesn't commit them to anything at all. It's a free rein, which is what they're after.
Well, but just because the Chinese Communist Party has lied about everything else doesn't mean they're lying about their commitment to climate change.
So you're a big-hearted guy, Matt. You think we should give them one more chance?
No, at least one more chance.
Right.
Yeah.
I hear.
No, maybe
it's really our fault for polluting so much.
Yeah. I mean, look, we had centuries to pollute, so now we shouldn't hold a developing country like China to the same standards. Like, we have to give them the opportunity to pollute for a couple centuries. Otherwise,
right.
it's unfair. So we should restrict ourselves and I think this is good because it also gives us our American-based multinational corporations an opportunity to manufacture stuff for cheap in China and not have to worry about all those externalities, like pollution.
Right.
So I think it's a great opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. It certainly needs to have a manufacturing heartland reasonably intact if it's going to maintain its power and its ability to power project around the world. You can't offshore everything. And you're right, Shelley. A lot of this stuff's moved to Vietnam. Clothing, textile, and footwear's gone into Bangladesh. Some stuff's gone into India, which is not an easy place to do business either. The Apple iPhones are made there now. But none of those things is going to take away the size and scale of what China offers. And, they've been very good at negotiating, using access to that huge market as a negotiating tool. I was at a healthcare conference in Hanoi, Vietnam, that was put on by the Vietnamese Health Ministry and the US Embassy. We had David Shear was the then ambassador to Vietnam. We went to Hopkins Nanjing. A friend of mine who was government relations for Pfizer was also there, and he stood up and he said to the Vietnamese, "Look, the Chinese government is very pragmatic, and they help us with access to land, and there's various incentives to go in and invest. And China's been very good at that, actually. And if you compare them with Vietnam's the size of one province of China. It's nowhere near as attractive, for a company to go in and invest, because it doesn't compare in terms of the market size."
Well, we are almost out of time, but there is one thing I wanted to kind of talk a little more about. Some of your ideas about the Pacific. Speaking of World War II, I know you've been talking about this idea of like a Pacific Peace Corps.
Yeah, so it's very hard to compete against China on your own. Certainly, Australia's the big player in this part of the world. I'm not terribly well traveled in the Pacific, but I was doing a project in Manila in 2016, and a buddy of mine who's run a dive travel agency, I said, "Hey, at the end of this project, I want to go. I haven't been diving for a while. Can you recommend a good place?" He knew the Philippines well. He suggested I go to Palau. So I went to Palau, and it's about maybe 800 miles to the east of the southern part of the Philippines, Davao. And it's kind of in the middle of nowhere, as a lot of these Pacific countries are. Palau's an interesting one. It's only 18,000 people. The ecosystem there is unique and breathtaking. It's the best diving I've ever done. It was mind-blowing, just beautiful, And China's been pursuing Palau, and Palau has stuck with the current arrangement with Taiwan, although, the Taiwanese used to throw money at these countries too. Palau has the Capitol building in Koror is it's a scale model of the US Capitol, for a country with the size of 18,000 people, and it was paid for by a loan from Taiwan. And when Ma Ying-jeou became president of Taiwan, he said, "Oh, we're not doing this anymore. We're not doing this, bribing, bidding thing with China," and so it stopped. But that Capitol building, they ended up having to kind of evacuate it because it wasn't built for the tropics, and it got mold and everything. It has the smallest population of any capital in the world. But I think with Palau, when I landed, there was a plane load from mainland China that got in there before me, and there was about 7 charter flights arriving a week. And so what I saw was this culture clash, bearing in mind that a lot of people in mainland China have never been overseas before. So it was all a brave new world for them. And of course, Xi Jinping just clipped their wings and clipped their passports as well. So it makes it very, very difficult to leave China now. But I think the Palinese government got a bit of a fright because they realised, the amount of kind of human traffic, as it were, has the ability to change these small states almost overnight. The changes happens at breathtaking speed. And what I could sort of pick up was that the locals were starting to feel like kind of second-class citizens in their own country, And while I was there, I met some US Navy engineers just in their civvies, and I got chatting to them, and they're there on a kind of rotational basis. But Palau has a thing called the Compact of Free Association with the US. They use the US dollar. There's bank branches from Bank of Hawaii and stuff like that. But the Compact of Free Association means that the US military is responsible for its defense if Palau puts its hand up and says, we need you. The new leader in that country has gone out and asked the US to set up a military base there. I said, please, if you'd like to, come and set up a military base here. So I think, and it's interesting that the most outspoken member state of the Pacific Forum was the president of Micronesia, who wrote this letter to Federated States of Micronesia, wrote to all the members of the Pacific Forum, really strong letter, an excerpt of which I read out on Sky News the other day, warning the other states, basically a caveat emptor, understand what you could be potentially getting into here. And so, China's been good at building visible infrastructure, some of it white elephant stuff that's not really needed. Again, that's not fit for purpose. And Australia's been involved in the region for a long time on the softer skills and things like healthcare and disaster management and stuff. We don't pay bribes to buy off the corner office, which is something that China does do. I'll say it right now, they do that. I mean, there's a Harvard paper comparing the way SOEs go about things and how they communicate with the mafia. So I'm not the only one that's saying that. But I think this is a case where, Cleo Pascal has written some great stuff about how different countries can perform different roles. So, it might be Australia's good in healthcare. It might be that Japan's good at fisheries management. I'm making it up as I go here. But I think we need all hands on deck. I think we need the French, who have some skin in the game in the Pacific, the Americans, obviously. And I think this has been a bit of a wake-up call to the US as well. Kurt Campbell flew to Honiara to meet with the Solomons leaders. Caroline Kennedy has been confirmed as the new US ambassador to Australia. And, of course, her father was rescued in Guadalcanal. And, I mentioned that cemetery in the Philippines. We shouldn't forget the sacrifice. You stand in that cemetery, you see all these white crosses, and you think this was a young guy, 20-something, that died so far from home, fighting to liberate these territories. We shouldn't forget that. We should remember that. These countries are sovereign countries, and we need to respect that. But that sovereignty has a kind of red tinge to it, and it's the blood of all the people that sacrificed, that gave their lives to make sure these countries are free. And I would be reminding the leader of the Solomons, if I was there, of that history. And we shouldn't forget it. So it's good to see that, people's memories are being jogged by some of this stuff. We don't want to go through that experience again.
So the Peace Corps idea is that all these countries would, come together, send people there to help the Pacific nations, or?
Yeah, I think you could do something, and you could call it the Pacific Peace Corps, if you like. Mm-hmm. And it might be something like, the Tom Cruise bomber jacket with the flags on it. But it would be the flags of participating countries, like-minded countries that are in these countries doing good and making a contribution. I mean, there's a fair criticism of countries in the major economies in the region. I mentioned the US, Australia as well. We all could have done better, and we all and need to lift our game and show up. We need shoes on the ground, perhaps rather than boots on the ground. And we need to do better. I mean, Papua New Guinea is the biggest country in the region. They hosted APEC a couple of years ago. Xi Jinping attended, and they built some white elephant infrastructure there. But then Australia, New Zealand, and the US said, well, we're going to provide you the electricity grid. We're going to build your electricity grid because most people in PNG don't have access to electricity. What's happened in the last 2 years since then? Nothing. Nothing's been done. So if we don't deliver on what we say we're going to do, it destroys credibility, and people need to get out into these markets, into these countries more. And we talk about the Pacific family here in Australia, but if we're a family, we need to have more islanders coming here to study and work, and we need more young Australians and others going out and spending a year in a hospital if they're training and that kind of thing. And there ought to be incentives and coordination around that.
It makes a lot of sense. It's kind of like what you were saying about medicine being a factor of superpower. That, it doesn't matter if China builds like some skyscraper that will sit empty in Palau or any Pacific Island nations. Like if the Western world can actually get together and give things that are actually needed, that will go much further than, China's empty infrastructure promises that come with crippling debt.
And like resource extraction on a huge level.
And making people in these countries seventh-class citizens.
Yeah, well, I mean, in Kiribati, they have a thing called, I think it's called PIFA. It's the Pelican Islands Marine Sanctuary. And it contains the world's largest stocks of tuna, 700,000 tonne a year. Now, that's been protected from being harvested up until a year or two. And it's no coincidence, in my view, that China's been putting pressure on to get access to that area. I mean, it's, half the size of Western Europe. It's a vast area of ocean. One of the critical things going forward is going to be monitoring fishing. And that's another area. That's an area where the Quad is perhaps going to deliver its first tangible capability, which will be to monitor and map fishing fleets in the region, because China is by far and away the world's largest illegal fisher. And it's gone around the world, say off Ghana or off Somalia. Somalia has a long Indian Ocean coast. Chinese government paid cash to leadership there for fishing rights. And so, but the Pacific Islanders are not stupid. They're understanding what's going on. And I think even in the Solomon Islands, where Sogavare is a very controversial figure, they're not going to get, they're not going to get it all their way. The pushback on the regional agreement, which we've seen in the last couple of days, it's a loss of face for Wang Yi. It's a setback for China's agenda in the Blue Pacific. They're not going to win all the battles. They don't have all the aces. We need to get our groove on and get our game going again. And we need to show up and we need to compete.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today and talking about some of the ways that we can compete with China.
Good fun, Chris. Good to see you all. And I'll see you next time on General Hostility.
Absolutely. We'll still be making plenty of those, I have a feeling.
I think it's going to ramp up in the next few months, probably.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah.
See you guys. Thanks a lot.
All right.
Thanks a lot.
See you.
Cheers.
Thank you for watching this episode of China Unscripted. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Ganeshta.
We'll talk to you next time.